The morning mist clung to the Clearwater River like a whispered promise, its silver surface reflecting the first golden rays of dawn. Thomas McKenna stood at the water's edge, his worn boots sinking slightly into the muddy bank as he adjusted, the heavy pack on his shoulders. At 17, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned early that the world owed him nothing, and that kindness was a choice, not an obligation. He had been walking for 3 days now, following the river north toward the settlement of Cedar Falls, where he hoped to find work at the lumber mill. Behind him lay the burnt remains of the orphanage that had been his home for 8 years. Destroyed in a fire that had claimed not only the building, but also the only family he had ever known, Sister Mary Catherine, who had taken him in when he was just a boy of 9, running wild and half-starved after his parents died of fever. The sound of labored breathing caught his attention, and Thomas turned to see an elderly native man struggling to make his way down the steep bank toward the river. The man's left leg was twisted at an odd angle. It's clearly broken long ago and never properly healed, and he leaned heavily on a gnarled walking stick. His weathered face was etched with lines of pain, but his dark eyes held a fierce determination. That Thomas recognized the look of someone who refused to give up, no matter the odds. Without hesitation, Thomas dropped his pack and hurried toward the stranger. "Sir, let me help you," he called out, his voice carrying across the morning air. The old man paused, studying Thomas with curious eyes. He spoke in accented English, his voice like gravel worn smooth by water. "You would help me, young one, even though you do not know me?" "Everyone needs help sometimes," Thomas replied simply, extending his arm for support. "Where are you trying to go?" "Across the river," the man said, accepting Thomas's steady arm. "My granddaughter. She is with child, and the birth comes soon. The medicine she needs grows only on the far side, in the sacred grove where my people have gathered healing plants for generations." Thomas looked at the swollen river, running high and fast with spring snowmelt. The nearest bridge was 20 miles downstream, and the current here would be treacherous for anyone, let alone an elderly man with a disabled leg. But something in the stranger's eyes, a mixture of desperate love and unwavering faith, touched a chord deep in Thomas's heart. "I can help you cross," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. He was a strong swimmer, but the river was dangerous, and one mistake could cost both their lives. The old man's eyes widened with surprise, and something that might have been hope. "You would risk your life for a stranger." Thomas thought of Sister Mary Catherine, who had taught him that love was not about blood or birthright, but about the choices you made when faced with another's need. "She's your granddaughter," he said. "That makes it important." What followed was a careful, painstaking journey across the churning water. Thomas fashioned a crude raft from fallen logs, using rope from his pack to lash them together. He helped the old man onto the makeshift vessel, then guided it slowly across the river, fighting the current every step of the way. Twice they nearly capsized, and once Thomas had to dive into the icy water to retrieve the walking stick that had been swept away by a sudden surge by the time they reached the far shore. Both men were exhausted and shivering, but the old man's eyes shone with tears of gratitude. "You have given me the greatest gift," he said, clasping Thomas's shoulder with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "What is your name, young hero?" "Thomas McKenna," he replied, helping the man to his feet. "And I'm no hero, sir. Just someone who believes in doing what's right." The old man smiled, and for a moment Thomas saw past the weathered features to something ancient and wise. "I am called by Thunder, medicine man of the Shoshone people. And you, Thomas McKenna, have shown me that the Great Spirit works through all hearts that are pure. My people must hear of this." Thomas helped Called by Thunder gather the medicinal plants he needed, delicate white flowers that grew in the shadow of ancient oak trees, their petals soft as silk and fragrant as honey. As they worked together, the old medicine man spoke of his granddaughter, Munanwater, whose husband had died in a hunting accident just months before. She was alone now, carrying a child she would raise without a father. The difficult birth ahead of her had the entire tribe worried. She is beautiful as the morning star, called by thunder said, his voice heavy with concern. But her heart has turned to stone since her husband's death. She speaks to no one, eats little, and sometimes I fear she has lost the will to live, the baby. It is her only connection to hope now. Something in the old man's words stirred an unexpected longing in Thomas's chest. He found himself thinking of a woman he had never met, carrying a burden of grief he understood all too well. She sounds like someone who has loved deeply, he said quietly, called dash by dash thunder, studied him with those penetrating dark eyes. Yes, and that kind of love, once lost, leaves scars that run deeper than any physical wound. But perhaps there are miracles yet to come. After helping Call by Thunder cross back over the river, an easier journey this time. As Thomas had learned to read the currents, Moot the young man prepared to continue his journey north. But the medicine man caught his arm, his grip urgent. My friend, you have saved not just my life today, but the life of my granddaughter and her unborn child. My tribe must know of your kindness. Will you come with me to our village, just for one night, so that I may properly thank you? Thomas hesitated. He needed to reach Cedar Falls, needed to find work before his meager savings ran out entirely. But something in Call by Thunder's voice, a note of desperate hope, made him reconsider. Just for one night, he agreed. The Shoshone village nestled in a valley between rolling hills. Its cluster of traditional lodges and more modern cabins, creating a picture of a people balanced between past and future. As Call by Thunder led Thomas through the settlement, curious faces peered out from doorways, and children ran alongside them, chattering in their native language. But it was the young woman sitting alone outside one of the larger cabins who captured Thomas's attention completely. Even from a distance, he could see that she was beautiful. Long black hair that caught the afternoon light like raven's wings, and a profile as delicate as carved ivory. But it was the profound sadness that seemed to surround her like a visible aura that made his heart clench with unexpected emotion. Moon and Water, Called by Thunder, called softly, and the woman looked up, her dark eyes focusing on her grandfather with mild interest before sliding over to Thomas with polite indifference. She was perhaps 20 years old, Thomas guessed, with high cheekbones and full lips that might have been quick to smile in happier times. Her pregnancy was clearly visible beneath the simple blue dress she wore, and one hand rested protectively over her swollen belly. But it was her eyes that haunted him, deep wells of grief that seemed to hold all the sorrows of the world. Called dash by dash thunder, spoke rapidly in Shoshone, gesturing toward Thomas. And Moon on Water's expression shifted from indifference to surprise, then to something that might have been the faintest spark of curiosity. She replied in their native tongue, her voice soft as flowing water, but edged with a weariness that made Thomas want to reach out and offer whatever comfort he could. She thanks you for helping her grandfather, Called by Thunder translated. Though Thomas suspected there had been more to her words than simple gratitude. She says you have a kind face. Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he managed to keep his voice steady. Tell her it was my honor to help, and that I hope her baby comes safely into the world. Moon on Water's eyes widened slightly at the translation, and for just a moment, Thomas thought he saw a crack in the wall of grief she had built around herself. She spoke again, this time looking directly at him, and he felt his heart skip a beat at the intensity of her gaze. She asks why you helped a stranger, Called by Thunder said, but his own eyes were now studying Thomas with new interest. Says most white men would have passed by. Thomas considered the question seriously, knowing that his answer mattered in ways he didn't fully understand. I helped because it was the right thing to do, he said finally. Because someone once told me that love isn't about who shares your blood, but about who you choose to care for. And because everyone deserves to have someone fight for them when they can't fight for themselves. As Called by Thunder translated, Thomas saw something remarkable happen. The grief in Moon on Water's eyes didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else, a glimmer of recognition, as if she had seen something in him that resonated with her own wounded heart. That evening, the tribe gathered for a feast in Thomas's honor. He sat beside Called by Thunder at the place of honor. overwhelmed by the generosity of these people who had welcomed him as family. The food was simple, but delicious fresh. Trout from the river, wild rice, and berries that tasted like summer sunshine. But Thomas found his attention constantly drawn to Water, who sat across the circle from him, speaking little but watching him with those haunting dark eyes. As the evening wore on and the stories began, tales of ancient heroes and great loves, of battles fought and won, of the sacred connection between the people and the land, Thomas felt something shifting inside his chest. This place, these people, felt more like home than anywhere he had ever been. And the woman across the fire, with her mysterious sadness and quiet strength, stirred feelings in him that he had never experienced before. When Called by Thunder rose to speak, a hush fell over the gathering. The old medicine man's voice carried clearly in the night air as he told the story of Thomas's brave act, but he embellished it, making it sound more heroic than it had felt at the time. Thomas squirmed with embarrassment, but he noticed that Water was leaning forward now, her attention completely focused on her grandfather's words. This young man risked his life for someone he had never met, Called by Thunder concluded, his eyes finding Thomas's across the fire. The Shoshone people honor such a man. What happened next would be burned into Thomas's memory forever. One by one, the members of the tribe rose and approached him, each offering a small gifta beaded bracelet, a carved bone whistle, a eagle feather, blessed by the medicine man. That Thomas's heart began to race. She approached him with quiet dignity, carrying something wrapped in soft deerskin. When she knelt beside him with difficulty, given her condition, Amos could smell the faint scent of sage and wildflowers that clung to her hair. "For you," she said in careful English, her voice like music in the night air. "My husband, he made this before he died." She unwrapped the deerskin to reveal a knife unlike any Thomas had ever seen. The blade was perfectly balanced steel, but the handle was carved from antler and inlaid with turquoise in the pattern of a river flowing toward mountains. It was clearly the work of a master craftsman, a piece that represented not just skill, but love and dedication. "Can't take this," Thomas whispered, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gift. "This belonged to your husband. It should go to your child." Water's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "My husband believed that some gifts are meant to travel, to find their way to the person who needs them most. You have shown me that there is still kindness in the world, that there are still people who will risk everything for a stranger. This knife was made by loving hands. It should belong to someone with a loving heart." As Thomas accepted the gift, their fingers brushed, and he felt an electric shock of connection that seemed to flow through his entire body. Water's breath caught, and for a moment they simply stared at each other, the rest of the world fading away. "Thank you," Thomas managed, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll treasure it always." Water nodded, but she didn't immediately move away. Instead, she studied his face in the firelight, as if trying to memorize every detail. "You have sad eyes," she said softly, "like someone who has lost much." "We all lose things," Thomas replied, unable to look away from her. "The question is what we do with what remains." "Yes," she whispered, "what we do with what remains." Night, Thomas lay awake on the comfortable bed of furs that had been prepared for him, staring up at the stars visible through the smoke hole of the lodge. He should be thinking about his journey, about the job waiting for him in Cedar Falls, about his uncertain future. The gentle strength in her voice, the electric moment when their hands had touched. He was being foolish, he told himself. He was a widow carrying another man's child, still deep in mourning for her lost love. He was a wandering orphan with nothing to offer but willing hands and a kind heart. What future could there possibly be for two such different people, from such different worlds? But even as he tried to talk himself out of his growing feelings, Thomas couldn't deny the truth that was taking root in his heart. In the space of a single day, this woman had become important to him in a way he couldn't fully understand. Not just because she was beautiful, though she was, but because he had seen something in her eyes that matched the loneliness in his own soul. The next morning brought an emergency that would change everything. Thomas was awakened before dawn by urgent voices and running feet. He emerged from the lodge to find Called by Thunder hurrying toward Moon on Water's cabin, his face etched with worry. "What's happening?" Thomas asked, falling into step beside. "The medicine man. The baby," Called by Thunder replied grimly. It comes too early, and there are complications. Moon on Water is in great danger." Thomas's heart clenched with fear as they reached the cabin. Through the open door, he could hear the sounds of women's voices, urgent and concerned, and beneath it all, the soft moans of someone in terrible pain. Called by Thunder disappeared inside, but Thomas remained on the threshold, feeling helpless and desperate. Hours passed like years. Thomas paced back and forth in front of the cabin, his hands clenched into fists, his heart pounding with a terror he had never known before. Other members of the tribe gathered, forming a quiet circle of support. But their worried faces only added to his anxiety. It was near noon when Called by Thunder finally emerged, his face gray with exhaustion but his eyes bright with relief. "She lives," he announced, and the gathered crowd let out a collective sigh of gratitude. The baby too a son, small but strong. The Great Spirit has been merciful. Thomas felt his knees go weak with relief, but before he could respond, Called by Thunder was continuing, his voice dropping to a more private tone. "But she is very weak, my friend. She lost much blood, and her spirit wavers between this world and the next. The birth has taken something from her that I cannot restore with medicine alone." "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, though he feared he knew the answer. "She speaks of joining her husband in the spirit world," Called by Thunder said quietly. "She has done her duty by bringing his son into the world, and now she wishes to rest." "Wow. I have seen this before, after difficult births. Sometimes women lose the will to live, especially those who have already suffered great loss." Thomas felt something fierce and protective rise up in his chest. "Let me see her," he said. Called by Thunder studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Slowly, perhaps that would be wise. Come on. The interior of the cabin was dim and smelled of herbs and birth sweat. Moon on Water lay on a bed of soft furs, her face pale as moonlight, her long hair spread around her like a dark river. In her arms she held a tiny bundle, her newborn son, perfect and peaceful in sleep. Thomas approached slowly, his heart breaking. At the sight of her fragility, "Moon on Water," he said softly. She turned her head toward him, and he was shocked by the emptiness in her eyes. Not the grief he had seen before, but something worse. A kind of hollow resignation that spoke of someone who had simply given up. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I couldn't leave," Thomas admitted, kneeling beside her bed. "Not without knowing you were safe." She studied his face for a long moment, and he saw a flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or confusion. "Why? You do not know me? You have your own path to follow?" Thomas looked down at the baby in her arms, then back at her face, and felt his heart make a decision that his mind might have questioned. "Because some paths change," he said quietly. "Because sometimes you meet someone who makes you realize that everything you thought you wanted was just marking time until you found what you really needed." Moon on Water's eyes widened, and for the first time since he had met her, Thomas saw a crack in the wall of resignation she had built around herself. "You speak strangely," she whispered. "I speak truly," Thomas replied, reaching out to gently touch the baby's tiny hand. "This little one needs his mother, and maybe his mother needs someone who will help her remember that life is still worth living." Tears spilled down Moon on Water's cheeks, and she turned her face away. "You do not understand. I have nothing left to give. My heart died with my husband. I am empty." "No," Thomas said firmly, and the conviction in his voice made her look back. "At him, you're not empty. You're hurt, and you're scared, and you've been alone with your grief for too long. But you're not empty. I can see it in the way you hold your son, in the way you fought to bring him safely into the world. You have so much love left to give. You've just forgotten how to give it to yourself." Moon on Water stared at him for a long moment, her breathing shallow and quick. "Who are you?" she whispered. "What manner of man speaks such words to a stranger?" "Thomas," felt his throat tighten with emotion. I'm someone who knows what it's like to lose everything. Someone who has been alone and afraid and convinced that the pain would never end. It finds new places to grow, new ways to heal both the giver and the receiver. He paused, gathering his courage for what he was about to say. I'm someone who looked across a fire last night and saw not a broken woman, but the strongest person I've ever met. Someone who has endured loss that would destroy most people, yet still found the grace to welcome a stranger with kindness. Someone I would be honored to stand beside if she would have me. The silence that followed was so complete that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Moon on Water's eyes searched his face. He could see the war being fought behind them, hope battling despair, love wrestling with fear. You would stay? She finally whispered. You would help me raise another man's child? I would stay, Thomas said without hesitation. I would love him as my own, and I would spend every day trying to earn the right to love his mother. Moon on Water closed her eyes, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. When she opened them again, something had changed. The emptiness was still there, but it was no longer absolute. A tiny flame of hope flickered in the darkness, fragile, but growing stronger with each breath. I am afraid, she admitted. So am I, Thomas replied, reaching out to cup her face gently in his palm. But maybe we can be afraid together. Maybe we can help each other remember how to be brave. What happened next was barely more than a whisper, but it changed everything. Moon on Water turned her face into his touch and whispered, Stay. Thomas stayed. He sent word to Cedar Falls that he would not be coming, and instead threw himself into learning the ways of the Shoshone people. He helped with the harvest, repaired lodges damaged by spring storms, and slowly, carefully, began the delicate process of courting a woman whose heart was still raw with grief. It was not easy. There were days when Moon and Water retreated so far into herself that she seemed unreachable. The weight of her loss threatened to pull her back into the darkness from which Thomas had helped her emerge. There were nights when she woke screaming from dreams of her dead husband, and mornings when she looked at her son with such profound sadness that Thomas feared she might slip away entirely. But there were also moments of unexpected joy. The first time Moon on Water really smiled was when little James, named for Thomas's father, grabbed Thomas's finger with his tiny fist and refused to let go. The first time she laughed was when Thomas attempted to help with the evening meal and accidentally added salt instead of sugar to the berry pudding, creating a concoction so terrible that even the dogs refused to eat it. Slowly, gradually, Moon on Water began to heal. It wasn't the kind of healing that erased the past or pretended her first love had never existed. Instead, it was the more difficult, or beautiful kind of healing that acknowledged loss, while still making room for new growth. She spoke often of her deceased husband, sharing memories that made Thomas understand why she had loved him so deeply. And in return, Thomas shared his own stories of Sister Mary Catherine, of the loneliness of growing up without family, of the dreams he had carried before they were all swept away by a greater purpose. The turning point came on a crisp autumn evening, 6 months after Thomas had first arrived in the village. He was sitting beside the river, watching the sunset paint the water gold and crimson. When Moon on Water approached with little James sleeping in her arms, "May I sit with you?" she asked, and Thomas's heart skipped at the formal politeness that had gradually given way to something warmer and more intimate. "Always," he replied, making room for her on the fallen log that had become their favorite spot. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the sky. James stirred in his mother's arms, making the soft baby sounds that never failed to make Thomas smile. "I have been thinking," Moon on Water said finally, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. "About what?" Thomas asked, though something in her tone told him this was important. She was quiet for so long that he began to worry. She had changed her mind about speaking. But then she turned to look at him, and in the moonlight, he could see that her eyes held a new kind of peace. "About love," she said simply. "About how it grows and changes and finds new ways to flourish. Like the sacred plants that bloom differently in each season, but are always beautiful." Thomas felt his breath catch. "Moon on Water. My husband taught me that love is not something you possess, but but something you give," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "When he died, I thought my capacity for love had died with him. But you have shown me that the heart is like a river. It may change course, but it never stops flowing." She shifted James to one arm and reached out with her free hand to touch Thomas's cheek. "I will always love my first husband. He gave me beautiful memories and this precious son. But I have learned that honoring his memory does not mean closing my heart to new love. It means being grateful for what he taught me about loving and using those lessons to love again." Thomas covered her hand with his own, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you saying?" "I am saying that I love you, Thomas McKenna," Moon on Water said, her words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I love your kind heart and your gentle strength. I love the way you hold my son as if he were your own blood. I love the way you have waited for me to heal, never pushing, always patient. I love the man you are, and the man you help me remember I can be." Thomas felt tears streaming down his face as he leaned forward to rest his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he whispered. "More than I ever knew it was possible to love someone. You and James, you've given my life meaning I never knew I was searching for." Their first kiss was soft and tentative, flavored with tears and hope and the promise of new beginnings. James slept peacefully between them, a bridge between their separate pasts and their shared future. The wedding took place the following spring. On the anniversary of the day, Thomas had helped Call by Thunder cross the river. The entire tribe gathered to witness the ceremony, which blended Shoshone traditions with the Christian elements that Moon and Water requested in honor of Thomas's upbringing. Called by Thunder performed the ritual. Speaking of the sacred nature of love that grows from kindness, the power of two wounded hearts to heal each other, as Thomas and Moon on Water exchanged vows beneath the endless western sky, the little James gurgling happily in his grandfather's arms. The young man who had once been an orphan with nothing but a kind heart felt the last empty places in his soul fill with joy. "Do you take this woman to be your wife?" Called by Thunder asked in the traditional words, "to love and protect, to honor and cherish, in sickness and in health, in joy and in sorrow, for as long as love shall live?" "I do," Thomas replied, his voice carrying across the valley like a promise. "For as long as love shall live." And Moon on Water, radiant in a dress of white doeskin, decorated with beads and wildflowers, spoke her own vows with a voice that rang clear and strong. "I take you as my husband, my partner, my heart's companion. I promise to love you with the same devotion I once thought was lost forever, and to build with you a life worthy of the love that brought us together." Years later, when Thomas was an old man surrounded by children and grandchildren, when the lumber mill he eventually built had brought prosperity to the entire valley, when he had become a leader respected by both the Shoshone people and the growing community of settlers, would still remember that moment as the true beginning of his life. But perhaps the most beautiful part of the story was still to come. On their 50th wedding anniversary, as Thomas and Moon and Water sat by the same river where their love had begun, she took his weathered hand in hers and smiled with the same radiant joy she had shown on their wedding day. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "Staying here instead of seeking your fortune in the world beyond?" Thomas looked around at the valley that had become his home, at the thriving community they had helped build, at the grown children and numerous grandchildren who filled their lives with laughter and love. Then he looked at his wife, still beautiful at 70, her dark eyes still capable of making his heart skip like a young man's. "My fortune was never out there," he said, raising their joined hands to his lips. "It was always right here, in a kindness that led to love, in a love that led to family, in a family that led to a life richer than any gold mine or cattle ranch could have provided." Moon on Water leaned against his shoulder, watching their great-grandson, James, named for both his ancestor and Thomas's father, playing in the shallows, where his great-grandfather had once risked everything to help a stranger. "The Great Spirit works in mysterious ways," she murmured, echoing her grandfather's words from long ago. "Yes," Thomas agreed, wrapping his arms around the woman who had transformed his life from a story of loss into a legend of love. "And sometimes, if we're very lucky, those mysteries reveal themselves as the greatest blessings we could never have imagined to ask for." As the sun set over the valley they had called home for 50 years, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to celebrate their enduring love. Thomas McKenna understood that some journeys don't end with reaching your destination. Sometimes the most important journeys begin when you choose to stay where love has taken root, and discover that home was never a place at all. It was always the people who choose to build a life together, one act of kindness at a time.